I just see he's come
Oh,
there.
we'll talk.
Oh, he
Sorry.
hasn't. All right, then no problem. I'll read it. Sure.
Okay. Okay. Well,
Okay.
it's lovely to see you all. Welcome. And we're delving into a subject that is not very often talked about, but I think it's absolutely fascinating. And we've been really pleased to have some talks already. And today I've called them shorts. So Nick is going to start off with telling us about what Jews might have been up to in Lithuania before they even came to South Africa. And Nick was educated at Rugby School and Magdalen College, Oxford. He read modern history between 78 and 81. He trained as a lawyer and spent his working life as a corporate transactional lawyer. He's a partner in several leading London law firms. Nick has a master's in historical research from Birkbeck College, graduating with distinction, and is a fellow of the Parkes Institute in the University of Southampton, which specializes in Jewish studies and Jewish Christian studies. He's a member of the advisory board of the Jewish Historical Society of England, co-chair of its North London branch. And his first book, The Jews of Lithuania, A Journey Through the Long 20th Century, was published by Valentine Mitchell late last year. And he's currently working on a book about the modern history of the Jews in Ireland, because that's the trajectory of his family. So, Nick, if you'll unmute, it's over to you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you to Geraldine for your very kind introduction. As you've said, my name is Nick Sayers. I spent my working life as a corporate transactional lawyer in the City of London. I retired from this about 3 years ago, and since then I've written a book about the modern history of the Jews of Lithuania. My book is not family history, but instead uses the outline of the experience of the paternal line of my family as a way of choosing the wider historical subjects to write about. My great-grandfather moved from Eichstättel in northern Lithuania to Cork in southern Ireland in about 1890. So using this outline, my book looks at questions such as, what was life like for Jews in 19th century Lithuania? If it was becoming more difficult, why was this? How and why did Jews emigrate? How did they choose where to go? Why did anyone go to Ireland? What happened to those who stayed behind during the First World War, during the interwar period, and why and how did the Holocaust happen in Lithuania? And how has Lithuanian government and society tried or not tried to come to terms with Lithuanians' involvement in the Holocaust? I should apologise at the beginning for the fact that I'm afraid I do need to leave the school after my short talk, because I'm hosting a talk for the Jewish Historical Society of England in my home in about an hour's time. So Geraldine has asked me to say just a few things about the role of Jews in agriculture in Lithuania in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. I think by way of background, I should say something about the role that Jews played in Lithuanian society in the early modern period. In other words, the period before Russia took control of Lithuania in the so-called Third Partition of Poland in 1795. Early modern Lithuanian society was highly stratified. Much of the land was owned by Polish landowning nobility who were Catholic. There was also a large class of Lithuanian peasants who were largely uneducated. They were also mainly Catholic, although some were Orthodox. Between these groups were the Jews, and many Jews lived in towns and villages which were owned by the nobility. It has been estimated that about 2/3 of the towns of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century were private towns owned by the nobility. Jews tended to live in these towns, not in the towns owned by the crown and the church. In towns owned by nobles, Jews made up a majority of the population, and Jews tended to manage businesses that they leased from the nobility. Many of these businesses were agricultural in nature, or at least the businesses derived from agriculture. Jews processed and supplied agricultural products and were increasingly involved in the production of alcoholic beverages, particularly beer, mead, and vodka, and they owned the taverns that supplied them. In 1795, there was the so-called Third Partition of Poland. This brought Lithuania under the control of the Russian Tsars, and this led to a fundamental change in the lives of Lithuanian Jews. Jews who were not involved in agriculture were required to assume the status either of burgher or merchant. Very many Jews moved to towns at this time, and direct Jewish involvement in agriculture heavily decreased. Official figures suggest that by the late 19th century, relatively few Jews were directly involved in agriculture. We have good figures about the extent of Jewish involvement in agriculture from the Old Russian census of 1897. We know that of the 66,132 Jews employed in the Kovno province in 1897, some 33.3% were employed in crafts and industry. A further 26% of all Jews in employment were employed in trade, with a mere 4% employed directly in agriculture. Just how remarkable these figures are becomes clear when they are contrasted with employment patterns of ethnic Lithuanians. A full 73% of ethnic Lithuanians were employed in agriculture, with a mere 7.6% employed in crafts and industry, and only 0.6% employed in trade. One should perhaps say that Jewish involvement in agriculture was probably understated by official statistics because restrictive Russian Empire laws caused many Jews to lease land illegally. Nonetheless, I think it is very clear that the overwhelming majority of Lithuanian Jews were involved in trade and crafts and not in agriculture. But a not insignificant minority did make their living from various agricultural activities, and these included cultivating grains and vegetables, operating orchards, dairy farming, and lake fishing. Others were involved in related businesses such as owning grist mills, buying seeds and machinery, and exporting agricultural products. Most Jews of late 19th and early 20th century Lithuania lived in conditions of very great poverty. The American Jewish Committee's report on the Jews in the Eastern War Zone, which was drawn up in 1916, describes this poverty. It said, "The Jewish population imprisoned in the Pale has festered in misery. The merchants have been obliged to resort to fearful competition. Working men, overcrowding their industries, have been compelled to work for starvation wages. Most of the Jewish homes in Russia are miserable hovels. In the great cities, the proportion of paupers amounts to approximately 1/5 of the Jewish population. In Odessa, in 1900, of a population of 150,000 Jews, no less than 48,500 were supported by charity." Late 19th and early 20th century Lithuania was also particularly affected by agricultural crisis. The Western European markets were flooded with cheap grain from the United States, making it harder for Lithuanians to export and reducing the price of agricultural produce and therefore of farmers' incomes. The situation was aggravated by differential tariffs, which encouraged grain export from central provinces of the Russian Empire. I thought I ought to conclude just by saying a few things about the different sorts of involvements that Jewish people did have in agricultural activity in late 19th and early 20th century Lithuania. I think that their involvement was of four distinct kinds. First of all, there were some Jewish-owned estates particularly in the so-called Suwałki region, where Napoleonic law, not Tsarist law, made it easier for Jews to acquire and own land. Secondly, there were some Jews known as Yeshuvniks who lived in Jewish or mixed villages, and they worked as what you might call peasant farmers. This had become much less common by the late 19th century, as most younger Jews had moved to cities or emigrated. Thirdly, there were some Jews involved in so-called near-urban farming. These Jews were involved in intensive farming of gardens and orchards on leased land, which were typically just outside towns and cities. And this allowed them to remain connected to urban Jewish communities. Jewish farmers were engaged in this kind of activity, and they tended to specialize in commercial crops such as cucumbers, beets, and tobacco. A famous example of this is the cucumber cultivation in the town of Kaidan. Finally, some Jewish people were involved in so-called household farms. This was farming in an informal way, designed to provide some supplementary income to many Jewish families. I hope that these comments provide a useful overview of this fascinating subject. I'm very sorry that on this occasion, I'm afraid I'm not able to stay and talk for longer. If you find this subject interesting, please do buy my book. It's called The Jews of Lithuania, A Journey Through the Long 20th Century, and it is available on Amazon. It covers this as well as lots of other subjects connected with Jewish life in late 19th and 20th century Lithuania. Thank you, and back to you, Geraldine.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for trying to eke out the agricultural parts. I just wonder if there are a couple of comments or questions that you could stay for that would be interesting. Does anybody want to comment on anything or ask Nick a question? Raise your hand or jump in. Otherwise, we can let Nick go and promote his book to the Historical Society and have a nice chat with them. So, Nick, thank you very, very much for being with us and for giving us this little summary. So, very much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Real pleasure. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. So, we'll go on to Zara, who contacted us because her family had been involved in the citrus industry. So Zara was born in Johannesburg as a sloot. I'll read it. She said, I went to Observatory East Primary School and then Bernata Park High School. I actually taught at Bernata Park High School for 1 year. I studied teaching at the Teachers Training College in Johannesburg and worked as a nursery school teacher for 30 years. My husband started his own motor parts business in 1978. I studied accounting part-time in order to assist him. I eventually stopped teaching in the year 2000 and worked full-time with him, handling the administration. After he passed away in 2014, I continued to manage his business. I sold it at the end of 2019. I enjoy playing bridge, reading, and doing Pilates and yoga. I've always had an interest in our family history and have documented and researched some very interesting stories and information. And her daughters made Aliyah to Israel, and I came to Israel. She came to Israel in 2021. Happily retired at Ranana. So, Zara, if you would like to unmute and have the floor. So, okay.
Thank you, Geraldine, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. And thank you, everyone, for joining our meeting. I hope you'll find this as interesting as I have. I'd like to begin with an introduction to our family, and then I'll continue with the contribution that Ivan Solomon and his descendants made to the agriculture in South Africa. My story tonight is about the journey of the Solomon and Landau families from Neustadt in Lithuania to Nelspruit. Neustadt is located in southwest Lithuania. It was under Prussian rule until it fell to Poland after the First World War. Jewish settlement there dates back about 200 years. Many immigrated to America and to South Africa in the 1880s. In 1897, the Jewish population there was about 2,000. My mother's grandfather, Yehuda Leib Solomon HaKohen, also known as Louis, was our pioneering ancestor who made the courageous decision to journey to South Africa in 1890 from Neustadt. He departed, leaving behind his wife, Henna Mindel Landau, and 2 children, Hannah and Jaime, who was my grandfather. From 1890 to 1897, Louis Solomon amassed great wealth affiliated to the booming ostrich feather industry in Oudtshoorn. I won't elaborate on this. I'll leave further information on this topic to Richard, which I know he will be covering next week. In 1897, Louis Solomon returned to Neustadt. He arranged for his father, Alexander Solomon, and his mother to go to Palestine. They lived in Jerusalem and were buried on the Mount of Olives in the early 1900s. Louis brought his wife, and she was known as Anne, and his daughter Hannah, who was 10 years old, and his son Jaime, of 7 years old. He brought them back with him to South Africa. His sister Malka, her husband Avraham Hyman, and his brother Benny Solomon, his wife Bessie Port, came with them to South Africa. And Anne's brother Morris Landau and his wife also came to South Africa. They all settled in Cilevitz. In Cilevitz, Ivan Israel Solomon, who was Louis's 3rd child, was born in 1897. And Ivan grew up in prosperous times. In 1913, the Solomon family and many others associated with the collapsed ostrich feather industry lost all their money. And the Solomon family, Louis, Anne, Jaime, Ivan, and another child, Bertha, left Cilevitz and went to Potchefstroom in the Transvaal. Ivan completed his schooling in Potchefstroom and then went to Pretoria University to study law. So now I'll go on to speak about Ivan Solomon and his descendants and their involvement and contribution to agriculture. Ivan graduated as a lawyer in 1921. In 1922, he became a partner in the law firm Friedland, Hart, Solomon and Nicholson in Pretoria. He married Lillian Golden in 1924, and they had one son, Dennis, who was born in 1926. The law firm had a client that owned a failing citrus farm. It was called Prudential Citrus Estates near Nelspruit. And the 4 partners bought the farm in 1925. In 1927, the partners sold their shares to Ivan Solomon, who became the sole owner. He then registered the farm as the Crocodile Valley Citrus Estate. At that time, it was one of the largest private citrus farms in the country. Although Ivan lived in Pretoria, he operated the estate with managers and staff in Nelspruit. He saw the farm through the challenging times of the 1930s and the wartime years. In 1932, he was appointed mayor of Pretoria for a 4-year term. He and Lillian supported many charitable organizations. They were involved in cultural activities in Pretoria, and they were patrons of the arts. In 1933, they hosted Irma Stern's first Pretoria exhibition, and they bought 2 oil paintings for the municipal art collection. Ivan was the director of the Citrus Board and was a leader in the industry for many years. His son Dennis qualified as a mechanical engineer, having studied at Wits University. He then went to Purdue University in Indiana, where he obtained a master's degree. Oh, there's a picture of Ivan. Okay, great. After graduating, he worked for Cadbury's Chocolates in their manufacturing plant. He returned to South Africa in 1958, aged 52, and he joined the family business. He lived on the estate in Nelspruit, and he was known as a visionary agriculturist. Dennis ran Crocodile Valley Citrus Estates and developed it into a world-class leading citrus farm. He was innovative in many regards. His innovations included the pack house that he designed and built to handle bulk fruit. The bulk handling system was labor-saving and was limited limited damage to the fruit. He set up hydroelectric power on the farm. He also introduced a dragline irrigation system. Until then, flood irrigation had been used. What was unique on the estate was the staff village that they built. They gave their workers very good housing. They gave them electric lights, purified water, and village amenities such as a primary school, a daycare center, a clinic with free medical service, recreational and sports facilities. And they also had subsidies given to children who wanted to go to high school. They subsidized their education. All this was unheard of in South Africa in the 1950s in the South African farming communities. Dennis was involved in developing varieties of citrus, the Alpha and Valencia varieties, most notably with the Ruby Valencia oranges, where the juice retains its red color after juicing. He was totally committed to the success of the citrus industry. He believed in a unified citrus industry. He was also a game farmer involved in wildlife management. He was a leading cattle farmer of beef and dairy. He farmed avocados and macadamia nuts. Dennis developed a new cattle breed called the Huguenot. This was in 1960. I don't know much about cattle, but apparently it's a hardy, drought and disease-resistant species. I suppose you can look it up. It's quite interesting. Not my interest, but anyway. His son, Mark, was born in 1960 in Nelspruit, and he grew up on the farm and eventually went to school in Pretoria. Mark studied agricultural management at the University of Natal, and he graduated in 1980. He then went on to do an MBA at the University of California and graduated in 1985. In 1995, Mark returned to South Africa to manage the family citrus estate. While farming in South Africa, he became a director of Outspan and then a director of Capespan in South Africa. From what I know, Outspan handled the citrus side of the fruit, and Capespan handled the deciduous side. In the year 2000, Capespan invested in Fisher Brothers Incorporated in Canada, and Mark then went back to America in the year 2000. Mark was offered a position to manage Capespan's interest in North America. He was based in Philadelphia to help open up the American and Canadian market for South African citrus and deciduous fruit. He later became CEO of Fisher Capespan. It was renamed Capespan North America. Mark oversaw the expansion of South African citrus into the North American market. In 2005, Dennis passed away, and he came back to South Africa to manage the farm, and he was the owner of Crocodile Valley Estate. From 2012 to 2017, he split his time between Mpumalanga and America. He managed citrus marketing for Cape Span, North America, and became the Senior Vice President of Procurement of Cape Span, North America. In 2018, Mark sold the family farm to Komati Fruits. Mark still has farms and many other interests in South Africa. He is a citrus marketing consultant in South Africa and serves on various boards in the industry. Mark was instrumental in growing Crocodile Valley Citrus Estate into a multifaceted business of many divisions and huge proportions. Exporting fruit, fresh fruit, I should say, from South Africa to North America is a very specialized and sophisticated process. It is difficult to comprehend the magnitude of an export-import business such as this. Mark is now retired and living in Cape Town. Although I've chosen to share the great success of this enterprise, it is really the pride and legacy belonging to Ivan, Dennis, Mark, and John Solomon. Now about John. John was born in 1965. He obtained a degree from an industrial engineering degree from Stellenbosch, and then went to the University of Washington in Seattle. He worked for Hewlett-Packard and became the senior buyer there. In 1996, he returned to South Africa to work on the family farm. He only worked there for 3 years because he missed the tech industry so much. He said, no, I cannot be a farm boy. I belong in the tech industry. So in 1999, he went back to America. He became manager for Hewlett-Packard for 14 years. He then worked for Apple for a short while. And here's the best part. He joined Google. In May 2018, he became vice president of Google Chrome operating systems. John went from a farm boy to Google's laptop executive. He now lives in California. My mother's uncle Ivan never forgot his nieces and nephews. He had seasonal fruit delivered to our homes. In the 1950s and 60s, a railway truck would deliver fruit to us. I remember the joy and excitement when the truck stopped outside our house on a Friday afternoon and the weekly delicious fruit arrived. It was delivered to the Kaplan and Gewisse families in Durban, the Maltz family in Krugersdorp, the Kalinko, Maltz, Sloot, Klein, and Kusner families in Johannesburg. We all had the pleasure and benefit of Uncle Ivan's generosity. It's been such a joy for me to research and uncover the role that my mother's uncle and his family have contributed to the South African citrus industry. Who could imagine that from humble beginnings in Nijstort and a farm that perchance came Ivan's way, a multinational world-class exporting business would emerge? It's been my pleasure to be able to share this part of my family's history with you all tonight.
Thank you so much, Zara. That was a wonderful presentation, and what an exciting and wonderful story. You know, we hadn't perhaps heard of Nelspruit and Crocodile Valley, so this was really important and interesting. Any comments or questions for Zara before we move on to citrus, deciduous fruit? Okay, well, let's move on, Gail. If you will kindly read us what Allan Wollman wrote. He's a descendant of the Serembok family from Ceres.
Okay, thank you so much, Zara. That was very, very interesting. And this isn't my world at all, really, but here I go. Okay, so the Seremboks of Ceres. I want to begin with a small memory. Growing up, like many South Africans, I drank Ceres, actually, fruit juice. To me, it was just a familiar brand on the table. Only later did I discover that in a way, my own family had helped plant the seeds, quite literally, of the farming traditions that made Ceres famous. So today I'd like to share a little about my family's role in the farming history of this remarkable valley. From what I've been able to piece together, my grandfather Louis and his brother Joseph arrived in South Africa around 1895. The records say they both came from Russia, although my grandfather's farm was called Little Prussia. With shifting borders back then, maybe both stories are true. What is certain is that the Cilevitz brothers were pioneers. They looked at the Ceres Valley and saw not just farmland, but the potential for something bigger. My great-uncle Joseph, in particular, became a leading figure. Around 1906, he established his farm near Ceres and began importing new fruit varieties and root stocks from as far afield as New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and California. He also introduced modern storage and marketing methods, unheard of at that time, that helped open the door to exports. By the early 1930s, Joseph had earned the title of Apple King and was recognized as the largest individual deciduous fruit grower in South Africa. Under his leadership, Ceres became a major supplier, at one stage providing nearly a third of the country's fruit exports. But Joseph didn't do it alone. His brothers, including my grandfather Louis, also farmed in the area. While Joseph might have been made the headlines, Louis ran a successful farm of his own and contributed to the growing community of farmers. Sadly, he passed away in the early 1930s, long before I was born. I never met him, but I did lovingly remember his wife, my grandmother Betsy. She lived to the age of 96 and often shared her wartime experiences from hiding in the Netherlands during the war. Together, the Cilevitz brothers helped lay the foundations for what Ceres would become, South Africa's fruit capital. Their hard work and innovation influenced not just their own farms, but the farming community as a whole. And while they had nothing to do with the later creation of the Ceres juice brand, I like to think that their vision and labor helped pave the way for it. Looking back now, what strikes me is that farming has always been about meeting challenges. For my family, it was carving out a future in a new land, figuring out irrigation and storage and building export markets. Today, our farmers face new challenges: climate change, sustainability, and global food security. The questions are different, but the spirit needed to face them, persistence, innovation, and community, remain the same. For me, that's the real legacy of my grandfather Louis and great-uncle Joseph. Not just the orchards they planted, but the values they lived by. Values that still echo in the Ceres Valley and in a small way in every box of juice with that name. And I'd just like to say that the Cilevitz, there were two Cilevitz in my class at medical school, Ian and Brian, and I wrote to them and I got a reply. They're both in America and they're both doctors actually. And Brian said to me this morning that Ian was involved in agriculture, but I didn't hear from him. So, okay, those were the Cilevitz, and I believe that Joss, who lives in Ceres, maybe you can add something to that, Joss Khan.
Do unmute Joss and say something. It'd be lovely.
Yeah, the farm Klein Price, Little Prussia, still exists to this day. And the Cilevitz are buried in Ceres.
Is that so? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Ian Cilevitz is a doctor, am I right?
Yeah.
And
He's
Ian,
a rheumatologist, or one of them is, yeah.
Yeah, he grew up in Ceres.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, his father had a store there. Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very good. So it's lovely to have you, Joss, with us, and you can see the orchards in front of you almost. So lovely, and thank you, Gail, so much for reading that. Ian sadly is not well and couldn't join us today, but you know, it's so interesting to know, as Ian said at the beginning, you know the names, but you don't realize who was behind it. The same with the the citrus, the Cape span, outspan fruit. You don't know who was behind it and who really created the market and the business and did it. And I imagine that, in Nick's, what he said, 4% were involved indirectly in farming, but probably they weren't involved directly in farming. They were trading in farming produce. Part of the trading was in farming produce. Anyway, let's move on to Charlotte, who's done a lot of research into the area. So Charlotte grew up in East London, married Dennis Wiener, and moved to Petersburg. They have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Charlotte has a BSc in pharmacy from Rhodes and an MA in Judaica from UNISA. She has done a lot of research, and she wrote the history of the Petersburg Polokwane Jewish community and the Jewish country communities of Limpopo, Northern Transvaal. And they're both available on the internet, and they're both actually on the whole website. You can get them directly from there. So, Charlotte, we look forward to hearing what you're going to tell us.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm telling you more about Lionel Phillips, who did a lot of work in forestry in the Zoutpansberg, the Makubuskloof, Heinertsburg, Tsenin area. So the Northern Transvaal Limpopo was the last region to be developed in South Africa. This was a vast area with many wild animals that were eventually eradicated as farmers began to settle on the land. There were several Jewish farmers in the area, mostly farming with cattle. Last week we heard of the Schlesinger's large citrus estate at Zebedela. An unknown contribution to agriculture in the Makubuskloof Tsenin area was that of Sir Lionel Phillips and his wife Florence, who promoted forestry in the area. Lionel Phillips was born in England on the 24th of August 1855, one of 3 sons in a lower middle-class Jewish family of English merchants. He did not have a formal education and started working for his father as a bookkeeper at the age of 14. However, he must have been clever, as he attended special classes at London University in French and chemistry. He was then employed as a clerk at a diamond dealer, where he learned to be a diamond sorter.
I'm just going to the car.
Okay. This inspired him at the age of 20 to travel to the Kimberley diamond fields in South Africa, where he made and lost his first fortune. In 1885, Lionel married Florence Orlep, whose father owned 10 claims on Colesberg Kop. She was captivated by this jovial and vivacious fellow, who was so knowledgeable and sophisticated with his little bowler hat and high-button Victorian suit and flowing moustache. Lionel became a mine manager and the director of the Griqualand West Diamond Company. He began to study for membership of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. After the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand Reef, the Phillipses and their 2 infant sons left for Johannesburg in 1889 in a hired coach. A maid and 2 nannies squeezed inside with them, and the Griqua servants on the roof. Through the influence of Cecil John Rhodes and Alfred Byte, he became a mining consultant to Herman Eckstein and Company at the Corner House in Johannesburg. Florrie left for an extended stay in England in 1893, where the difficult and demanding Florence Phillips was entertained by high society, including the Rothschilds. They acquired a residence, Tilney Hall, on a large estate in Hampshire. Meanwhile, their grand new house, Hohenheim, was being built in Parktown in Johannesburg, the first of the wealthy landlords' fancy homes on the ridge. This huge construction soon became known as Phillips Folly. As you can see the picture there, that's Lionel and Florence and their home Hohenheim. He also commissioned Sir Herbert Baker to build Villa Arcadia in 1909, which later became the Jewish orphanage. It appears that Florrie was not Jewish. According to Mendel Kaplan's book Founders and Followers, during the altercation between Rabbi Landau and Rabbi Hertz and their two congregations, Landau asserted in a letter that Hertz was supported by the mining magnates. And when Hertz suggested the amalgamation of the two congregations, Landau said that Hertz offered the presidentship to Sir Lionel Phillips, whose, quote, Christian wife and children attend church regularly, often accompanied by him. Lionel Phillips became a supporter of the Uitlander movement against the Transvaal Republic government, and he was a member of the Reform Committee, who wanted to overthrow President Kruger. After the failed Jameson raid, he and 3 other ringleaders were initially sentenced to death, but after 6 months they were reprieved by President Kruger and each received a fine of £23,000. When Florrie heard that he was going to jail, she quickly came back from London to come and give him support. He was exiled to Great Britain by Jan Smuts, but he returned to South Africa after the Second Anglo-Boer War. He succeeded Herman Eckstein as the chairman of the mining house, Herman Eckstein and Company. He was for many years the chairman of the Chamber of Mines and played an important part in the financial organization and technical development of the gold mines. Lionel entered politics in 1910, representing Yeovil. When gold was discovered on the Soutpansberg, Byte needed an expert report and sent Phillips there. In his book Some Reminiscences, 1923, Phillips described his journey to the Lowveld by coach and was captivated by the beauty of the area. He then walked together with a guide and several porters for about 30 kilometers over rough country. He loved the fresh air, the healthy exercise, and the freedom from the problems of management. He later returned to the area and traveled extensively, examining the different mining fields on the Murchison Range and bought several claims. Now, Lionel's wife, Florrie, decided to see the area for herself. So in 1906, she and her daughter Edith and her secretary, Miss Florence McLeod, visited Woodbush. She hired a wagon with 8 mules from Doel Zederberg, a transporter and close friend, and was driven by a colored driver who followed rudimentary tracks to Heinertsburg. They camped along the track, and the mule started to roll on some small trees at the side of the road. A white man appeared out of the wilderness and shouted at them that they were ruining his nursery of pine trees. He was Arthur Eastwood, the district forest officer, and he told them that they were on Crown land. Florrie charmed him and persuaded him to show her around the area the next day. They were to cooperate in developing the district. Eastwood showed her that many farms were being sold for nothing because of the Depression, and Florrie was fired up with the idea of showing the local people how to farm and grow arts and crafts from the forest. Florrie persuaded Lionel to travel by car, probably the first one to come, to Machubeskloof, and he was so impressed with the area that he gave instructions to the secretary of the Transvaal Land and Exploration Company, a subsidiary of the Corner House, to buy widely in Woodbush and the Lowveld. He bought the farms Broederstroom, Pypkop, and Spitskop, as well as 5 farms from Elton Troxel and Planche for £100 each, and they were renamed Broederstroom Stud Farm. Florrie had delusions of grandeur and wanted to employ the architect Sir Herbert Baker to build her a house in Woodbush, but Lionel balked at this extravagance. Florrie consulted extensively with Eastwood for her ambitious plans. She persuaded the Zederberg coach service to transport 194 paraffin tins filled with trees by donkey wagon to the Broederstroom stud farm. She also planted hundreds of thousands of oak and hardwood trees as well as fruit trees. The Phillipses intended to breed polo ponies and municipal mules, but the venture failed due to the unsuitability of the soil, which lacked the calcium necessary for the formation of strong bones in growing animals. As a result, the foals died. The idea of a stud farm was abandoned, and instead Aberdeen Angus and Shorthorn cattle were raised. She also brought in hundreds of goats, pedigree Nubian rams to be crossed with Boer goat ewes and pedigree alpines. The latter were prone to pink eye, and the endeavor was not a success. Another of her projects was to place trout fingerlings in the streams. Sir Lionel contributed extensively to forestry and the wood industry in the Heinetzberg area, as the government began promoting the planting of exotic fast-growing varieties of pine and eucalyptus. He founded the Woodbush Timber Company with Oscar Schlimmer and set up De Hoek sawmills. Lionel Phillips was knighted by the British King as Sir Lionel Phillips, Bart of Broederstroom, Northern Transvaal. Florrie contributed much to the area. On the 25th of June 1910, she started a branch of the South African National Union, SANU, which promoted industry and the export of South African products as part of the rebuilding process after the Second Anglo-Boer War. She also tried to promote the furniture trade. She persuaded Sir Herbert Baker to use Jim Smith of Machubiskloof to do the woodwork in the Union buildings in Pretoria. Several well-known names visited the Phillipses in Heinetzberg, including Sir Percy Fitzpatrick of Jock of the Bushveld fame, John Buchan, who wrote 39 Steps, and the biologist Dr. Rudolf Marloff, who did plant research in the area. Geoffrey Robinson, South African correspondent for the Times of London, wrote that Lionel Phillips is really a delightful travelling companion, so clever and keen about everything, and full of reminiscences of the days when he explored that country on foot. In March 1932, the Zoutpansberg Review reported that Sir Lionel hiked from Heinetzberg to Leitsdorp, a fair distance. Lionel and Florrie commuted between their homes in Heinetzberg, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and England. The Phillipses assisted the local farmers whenever they could. Two Jewish immigrants, Max and Wolf Israelson, bought the farm Turfloop, where the University of the North now stands. They built an earth dam on their farm, which unfortunately did not withstand the first rains. They toiled with little wheelbarrows to fill the gap in the dam wall. This only held until the next rainy season, when they had to repeat the exercise. The third year, whilst once again trundling their wheelbarrows, they were spotted by Sir Lionel and Lady Phillips, who were passing by. The sight of the two men labouring so hard moved Sir Lionel to acquire and donate 4 cocoa pans and tip lorries from the mines to replace the wheelbarrows. Together with the necessary rails, they were delivered by Zederberg's transport, and as the Israelsons had no foreknowledge of the gift, the Zederberg man had considerable difficulty in persuading them to accept the delivery. Lionel and Florrie had 2 sons, Harold and Francis Rudolph, and a daughter, Edith Minnie Nicholson. Lionel's son Harold became the manager of Broederstroom. When World War I broke out in 1914, Harold joined the Witwatersrand Rifles. He married Hilda Hills, a non-Jewess he met in Canada, where he went to study agriculture. Harold was well known for the many parties he held on his estate, and he soon became bored with farming. The estate started declining as the soil was worked out and the trees were felled, depleting the water supply. Harold died from a heart attack in his bed in 1926. Sir Lionel lost interest in farming and sold his farms to Johannes Merensky in 1929 for £38,000. Lionel retired to the Cape. He and Florence laid the foundations for the Johannesburg Art Gallery collection and the Michaelis Gallery in Cape Town. When he died on the 2nd of July in 1936 at Vergelegen in Somerset West, Sir Lionel Phillips left a title, but no vast fortune, due to his and his wife's extravagances. He and Florrie were buried in Brixton Cemetery, Johannesburg. His grandson, Sir Robin Phillips, lives in London.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm going to just run through the pictures that you've sent us. So this is possibly an orange plantation, is it?
That's Schlesinger's plantation in Zebedela.
Yeah.
And that shows you from Pietersburg going east to Tsenin and through Machubiskloof and Heinetzberg. And that's the area where the Phillips developed their forestry industry. That's Petersburg in the 1900s.
That we've seen.
That's when they started building the road to Heinetzberg. As you can see, it was very rudimentary. And this is Heinetzberg mill and store. Also very rudimentary in those days when Lionel Phillips was in the area. And this is the Israelson farm. This is where they harvested their crops on the farm. And that was a postcard I got from 1906 addressed to the Israelson. And that's part of the Israelson family, because they brought the whole family out from Latvia. And they all came to that area and they spread out and they had farms in that whole area.
So thank you very much for sending the pictures and for introducing us to Lionel and Florrie, who are absolutely amazing characters in South Africa. And people don't really realize how much they did, both in the mining industry, because, you know, really Lionel Phillips carried the whole thing after Biter died and Eckstein died. You know, Lionel Phillips was the one who really kept it going in a proper way. So thank you. Very nice. I think it goes very well into
Jean, this is Marion.
yes.
I just want to say that the Israelson family were Victor's family, my husband's family, and he continued in the farming line in cattle, and then later both of us together with the Proteas. We were farmers in Petersburg.
It's wonderful to have Marion with us, and Marion and Victor were pioneers in growing. Just say a couple of words about Proteas, Marion.
We were members of the Botanical Society, and they gave free seed to the members. And so we experimented with Protea seed, which there were indigenous Proteas on our farm. And they grew some species better than others. And it became a little business and a little export business. But mostly it was the most wonderful Protea project that got us into the mountains in the Cape and learning a lot about Proteas.
Thank you, Marianne. Any other comments before we move on to Ralph? And Ralph's done some research on milling. So we saw milling in the Northern Transvaal. So Ralph Cilevitz was born in Vryheid, Natal, studied electronic and mechanical engineering. He lived in Durban and Johannesburg before emigrating to Canada in 1979. He's had a career spanning 40 years as an industrial inventor stroke developer. Sounds interesting. In the high-tech and packaging industries based in Toronto, he's a board member of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Toronto. With over 50 years of genealogical research, he has over 90,000 people in his family tree. Ralph combines historical insight with a passion for storytelling. When he's not digging through archives, you'll find him competing on the track, in multi-event athletics, playing or umpiring field hockey, playing pickleball, or strumming the guitar. So, Ralph, over to you.
Just share my screen with you. We good?
Lovely.
Okay. Well, thanks, Geraldine, for inviting me over. Yes, I was a country boy born in Vryheid, northern Natal, which is in the middle of nowhere. and my father was a miller, and I thought that we were somewhat unique, but apparently not. So a few months ago, while I was on one of these meetings, there was a fellow by the name of Charles Heller who mentioned that his family was in the milling business, and I got hold of him, and we soon realized that it wasn't just me and him. So I started to look at Jewish-owned mills, and you look at the blue dots that I have there. There's only a dozen there, but all of them were Jewish-owned. All beginning from the late 1800s to like 1920, 1930. And the more I dug, the more I found out that almost, I'd say 80 to 90% of all the mills in South Africa were all Jewish-owned. And I thought, is this a coincidence or not? So I looked into it a little bit further. And as Nick said before, most of the Lithuania, or the Litvaks that went to South Africa were not agricultural people. It was maybe 1% or 2% of them. My grandfather was from Lithuania. He was a shoemaker. And my father was he just worked in his father's store. So they were very humble people. These are the towns in South Africa that the Jews settled in. I counted roughly 316 towns. And it mirrored quite closely where they came from in the Pale. So in the Pale between Lithuania and Latvia, there were roughly 350 shtetls with 7 major cities noted in the black dots. In South Africa, I found 316 little towns with 7 large cities indicated by the big dots. So they actually came into Cape Town and Durban, and then a lot of them went into the rural areas. And one of the reasons was that South Africa was a mining country. So there were 84 mining towns. There were 90 gold mining towns, 46 diamond mines, and about 130 coal mines. And there were hundreds of thousands of workers at these mines who had to eat, they had to be clothed, and the Jews of the time realized this was quite a good opportunity to go and sell them stuff. In South Africa, the dark brown areas were the coal mines, the gold areas were gold, and the letters with a D were the diamonds, which were mainly in the Kimberley area. And you'll see circled in red was Vryheid. That's where I came from. In the early days, the way to get from town to town selling things was with a hawker or a peddler or what was called a smose. And they would use these wagons, they would load them up with whatever they were selling and then move from town to town. And most of these smoses were Jews. I just took, for example, the area where I grew up. Ladysmith at the bottom was on the railway track. So they would start from Ladysmith, go up to Volksrust, Newcastle, Dundee, eventually get to Vryheid, which is marked with an X, and then move up to all the little coal mining towns. So what they were doing on the way was gathering a lot of information on what the locals wanted. They started to understand what the farmers needed on their farms, what the small towns needed in their towns. And they began to understand what the economy was there. A lot of times they would sell their wares to a concession store, which was typically on a mine, and then the concession store would sell to the locals. So how do we come to a milling industry? So not that I knew much about milling, but I started to look into why they even needed mills. And to cut a long story short, I'm not going to go through all the calculations here, but I figured there were roughly 14 million blacks who ate millipap or putu. And if you broke that down, they needed roughly 350 tons of millipap a day. And if the average mill produced 10 tons, you'd need roughly 35 mills or 35 towns. And sure enough, when I started looking in all the different areas, I found there were roughly 35 milling towns. In fact, I just see now in the Transvaal, there was Petersburg, which had the Brenner mill. But if you probably recognize a lot of these names, and each one of them had a mill, and each one was Jewish owned. So the question is, why did so many Jewish immigrants become millers? Well, the first thing was that there was chain immigration. So once one person went over to South Africa and got a job or opened a little store, he would save money and send back money for his brother to come, or his uncle or his sister. And so they would naturally come and join up with him and maybe go into whatever business or work he was doing. And there were strong community networks. So the Jews were unfortunately stuck in the middle of the Afrikaners and the British. They were basically foreigners in a foreign land. They didn't really, they weren't pro-British, they weren't pro-Boer or Afrikaner, but they weren't that trusted from everyone else, but yet they trusted each other. So they would loan each other money, they would set up community funds that would help people open businesses, and they really stuck together. Old world grain and trading knowledge. A couple of them were actually in the grain business in Lithuania. So when they came over, it was an easy transition for them to get into the milling business. But they were traders, they weren't peasants, and they knew how to buy and sell and barter and negotiate things. So milling was just something that they could get into quite easily. They understood the local economy. By going into the country, they understood what people could afford, what they needed, what they didn't need. And so they would simply bring in product from the bigger cities and then sell to the locals. The right place, right time. Between 1895 and about 1925, the railways were booming, and the English money or the British money was being put into the railway infrastructure, while the mines, they were also putting the money into the mines, while the Afrikaners were putting their money into agriculture. And so there was a void that allowed the Jews to sell to both of them. And vertical integration, typically a Jew, when he moved into a small town, he tried to open a store or worked in a store. Once he owned that store, he would buy or bring in other products. He may have started a mill, and once he had the mill going, he would take the flour and he would open a bakery and start selling bread. So it was a vertically integrated system that they were using. So my father, who came from Kosovo in Latvia, why did he go to Vryheid and why did he buy a mill? So he went initially in 1930 to Swaziland. He had a cousin by the name of Lapidus, and Lapidus had a small mill. My dad worked there for a couple of years, but his sister lived in Vryheid, and he wanted to be closer to her. So he moved to Vryheid, and there was a gentleman there by the name of Frame, Mr. Frame, who was selling his mill. He's the same Frame who was part of the Frame family that went into the Frame textile business. So my dad bought the mill, continued producing mealie meal, but it wasn't enough. As the population was growing, So he had a friend in Latvia. He brought him over by the name of Diamond, and they opened a new mill, a second mill. But in order to modernize the second mill, they needed some engineering expertise. So they went off to Johannesburg and they found a young engineer by the name of Wiener. And my dad employed him and his brother-in-law, who was Bauskin. Bauskin may have come from Nelspruit, I'm not sure. But anyway, so they got together and they were building these two little mills. There was another mill in the town owned by Mr. Falb, also a Jewish man, and that was a malt mill. And once they produced all their maize or flour or malt, they would sell it to wholesalers or independent bakeries or to the government. So as a Jewish boy, a Jewish country boy, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about the town I grew up in. We had a shul. We had about 40 Jewish families. That's shown on the left. On the top right is where my dad's mill was. It's has a red roof. That's the mill. The house with the green is his house that he built when he arrived there. And that's him at the bottom. He had a second little store in a little town, and that's him proudly standing in front of his store around about 1936. Our town had a shul, a rabbi, kosher meat, we had a cheder, we went to Habonim, we had a Chevra Kadisha and a cemetery. And the bottom legend shows you all the stores in the town. It was a very small town, maybe 2,000 people, but all the X's show you which stores were Jewish owned. So it was roughly about 45% were Jewish owned. That's the side of my dad's mill, and that's the back of the mill. So you could see it wasn't a very large mill. And his was a maize roller mill. The mills were either producing maize, which was made into millipap, or flour, which was made into baking flour. But being an entrepreneur, he also had in his store chickpeas and sorghum and beans, and he even sold eggs. So whatever they needed to do, they would do to survive. This was his, I guess, Bible at the time. He would read this cover to cover, which basically told the rural people what was going on the farms, giving them hints and ideas of what to do. Now, there were many families like mine. The Heller family from Worcester, Cape. This mill was started in 1920 by Solomon Heller. And this is the gentleman who I spoke to about the fact that there were so many Jewish-owned mills. This is the Brenner family, very successful family in Petersburg, Transvaal. This was the Rudowitz family in Pretoria, the Schechter family from the South African mining company in Port Elizabeth. And I can go on and on and on. And here are all the major players and towns of South Africa. You can't really see them so well, but almost everyone was Jewish owned. The town cycle, unfortunately, I think this is typical of all the rural towns, was the immigrant would arrive in the city, they'd end up in the small town, they'd spend somewhere between 1 and 17 years in the town, and then their children would need higher education, which it wasn't in the town. So they would go to the city, they would find a partner, they would get married, they'd have babies, and they would never return to the small town. So the older people who are now living in the small town became grandparents, and they moved back to the city to be with their children and grandchildren. They either remained there or they immigrated. The big six today, you may have heard of these companies: Pioneer Foods, Tiger Brands, Premier Group, are massive companies. Of the 6, 4 of them were all started by Jewish families. Tiger Brand, which is Tiger Oats, the Cohens, Epsteins, Levinsons, and Levys started that company. The Premier Group was the Marx families. Feed Corp was Alec, Mendel, and Manny Kroc. And between all of these 6, they produce something like 8 million tons of maize and flour per year. So the legacy wasn't that they were just millers. It was for their survival. They created an environment for children to grow up in. They built schools, they educated their children. And it was never just about the flour. I'm going to unshare.
Well, thank you so much, Ralph, and for your beautiful pictures and very fluent and beautiful presentation. I can tell you that in Kimberley, the Ralph family owned several mills, and you have left Kimberley out altogether, and I'm sure there may be other places as well, but you've made your point very clearly. So that's our story prepared for today, and it's you know, I don't know whether anybody's got extra little bits that they want to add to this. I know, Gail, you said there was a family who dealt with irrigation. Is that Linda?
Yes, Linda, well, yeah, she sent, you prepared that lovely Google sheet, and then Linda sent information about her family. So maybe, Linda, you'd like to tell your parents' story, your father, your family's story. It's so interesting. You just have to unmute yourself. Still not unmuted. On the bottom left.
I got it.
There you go.
My father's side came from, my grandmother, Manchester, England, but my grandfather had come from Russia as a very young man, and he started trading in South Africa in all the linens and the products from Manchester, England. And he used to go back and forth to South Africa. And eventually, when my dad was about 12 years old, he decided to move the family from Manchester, England to South Africa. And he continued trading in fabrics, a lot of the Scottish fabrics, the Scotty skirts, and that type of thing. And the family was growing up in South Africa. My father went to university there and did chemical engineering. And then he decided, as in with the graduate, plastics was the future. So he convinced his dad that he needed to go to America to study something about this new developing plastics industry. And my grandfather sent him to America, and he bought a bunch of machinery there, specifically injection molding machinery, and also plastic extruding machinery, which he brought back to South Africa. He was supposed to have been, had people from the companies that he bought it from come out and help him, but they didn't. But they bought a piece of land in Belleville South, which is where the family migrated to after living in Sea Point. They all moved to Belleville in Cape Town. And my father started this factory in Belleville South. They were making all sorts of plastic products. I mean, just anything, little doll toys, kids' tea sets. And also from the extrusion line, they started making hose pipe, and some of those, we grew up with them on our lawn, sort of a long plastic tapered thing that had holes in it that we used to love running through on hot days, and all sorts of plastic type sprinkler parts. And eventually the business evolved into making hose pipe. And then from hose pipe, it developed into drip irrigation as that industry improved. And that was eventually the direction that the company went in, was in drip irrigation. And then I think it was in about 1985, the business was sold. My father passed away, unfortunately, in 1965, and his brother continued to run it, but he sold it in about 1985. And the family are all living in the United States. And actually, my husband and I started an irrigation company here in the United States, following in my father's footsteps. So we're heavily in the irrigation market in the States, but pretty much out of it in South Africa now.
Thank you, Linda.
Is there anything else you?
None of the
wanna know?
agriculture could proceed without irrigation.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up. Sorry.
Yeah, so none of the
I can't hear you. Maybe if I unmute myself, it will. Or if I mute myself, hold on.
can anybody else hear me? Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. Anyway, interesting, because agriculture cannot survive without irrigation. So it's nice to end up with something. I think we've learned a lot of what's happened behind everything we thought we knew in South Africa. So I really would like to thank Zara and Ralph and Charlotte and Nick, who's not here anymore, and also Gail for reading Allan Wollman's piece about the Sarembok. So
I just wanted to say, if I could just say something, sorry to interrupt you, that Linda's family, the Raskins, her uncle, I understand, right, Linda? Rodney, he came to Israel, and he actually was one of the people who created or established drip irrigation in Israel, which was an absolute boon to the agricultural industry here. And my mother, who today,
he learned,
Yeah.
he went to the kibbutzim in Israel,
Okay.
and they were
Oh.
pioneering it. And then he
I
took it
see.
back to South Africa from there.
I see. So it was the reverse. Okay.
It was,
Was-
Israel really was the place where it was
I didn't
pioneered.
realize that, actually. You might
Yeah,
have
yeah.
told me. But my mother, interestingly enough, it was one of her things. She's today 98. Whenever she walked with me anywhere where there was drip irrigation, she used to stop and say, just look at that. That's what Rodney did. So, it was like part of this country, the drip irrigation, which it is. It's an amazing, amazing invention, say, in Israel, in the kibbutzim, right? Mm. So you're still involved with irrigation
that's
in
where
America?
it first started.
Yeah.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. In fact, my sons started an irrigation company as well.
Is that
And
so?
so they're in the irrigation business here as well.
Okay, that's lovely.
Geraldine, can I just say something? And I know Dennis started a dragline irrigation. I don't know if they're what the difference between drip irrigation is and dragline.
I think that
I know the dragline irrigation was an overhead sprinkler system, which provided the increased efficiency of watering, and it delivered water and nutrients directly to the soil and not on the plant, which was for optimal growth. But I don't know if drip irrigation and dragline is the same kind of thing.
it's slightly different. I think that dragline was probably the forerunner of drip irrigation, but the principle, I noticed when you talked about it that you went from flood irrigation, because when we came to California, that's how the farmers were farming, was all with flood, and there was a huge educational process to get them to use drip irrigation. But the dragline, I was wondering, is the forerunner of drip, but the principle is the same. It's to efficiently irrigate. And then
Yes.
it was very good because it was raised above, and so you
Yes,
could
it is
plow
an
the
overhead
field.
system as well, also an overhead system.
Drip can be the way they do it here in the grape industry is the grapes are staked and then the wires are joined from grape bush to grape bush, and the vines are trellised along, and the drip irrigation is also trellised.
But beneath it.
Not on the ground, not on the
Oh,
ground.
on the ground. Oh, yes.
No,
Okay.
a lot of drip irrigation is on the ground, but the way in certain industries, they do it like you describe, where they
It was overhead.
yeah, and not exactly overhead, but maybe a foot on stakes, a foot above, wire stakes, and it would be trellised along. Also because it's easier to weed, and it's
Okay,
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, but no, but the drip irrigation specifically is not usually overhead. But yeah, I noticed you used the term, and I was wondering what the difference was, but you're saying it's overhead.
Look, I don't really know much about irrigation, but I kind of researched it a little bit so I could be aware.
You used my father's name, so were you aware that that was done?
What was your father's name?
Dennis?
No, Dennis was Dennis Solomon, I mentioned.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Dennis. Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
No, that's why I thought, wow, did you actually, is that where they bought their dragline irrigation from?
Cousin. No, my mom's cousin.
Okay.
Interesting, yeah.
Well,
Yes.
we've had a lovely, anybody want to jump in and say anything? Next week is our last of our 4 sessions for November, and will be Professor Richard Mendelsohn will be talking to us about ostrich kings and about Sammy Marks, and he'll meld the SMOS into it as well. So we've got one more meeting to get together, and look forward to seeing you, and hope that it might keep you at the tip of your seats and interested in what we're talking about. So thanks very much. Thanks, Gail. Thanks again to Zara.
Thank you. Quite a unique evening, I'd say. I don't believe that people have ever really spoken about agriculture, like in this way. It's lovely to think. Who would have thought? I never knew the Mills were Jewish. Okay.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Geraldine. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you.
Good night.
Good
So
night,
thank you all very much.
Bye-bye,
Thank you all
everybody.
for coming.
Lovely to see you all.
And sleep well.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.